It is often said that now is Africa's time. Africa accounts for many of the fastest growing economies in the world. But with the growth of Africa comes new challenges. And Kenya, situated on the equator on Africa's east coast, is not immune. Although Kenya is the largest and most advanced economy in East and Central Africa, 46% of Kenyans still live below the poverty line. One of the many factors making it harder for Kenya to grow its economy and uplift more of its people is climate change. Climate change already affects Kenya and will pose even more challenges to growth and development in the future, due mainly to increasingly unpredictable weather and more extremes of drought and floods. An essential requirement for Kenya's growth is more electricity generation. But Kenya knows that it needs to increase generation capacity in a way that does not make it part of the problem and increase greenhouse gases or lock it into fossil fuel dependence.
The Constitution requires the government under the Bill of Rights to deliver to every Kenyan a clean and healthy environment. We cannot deliver a clean and healthy environment without looking at aspects of pollution. The biggest culprits, of course, for having caused climate change, because especially those that are, of course, from human-driven activities.
One way for Kenya to get much-needed assistance with its power generation is to access global climate finance.
Global climate finance is a process that is run through the United Nations from a Convention on Climate Change. At the moment, the biggest source of finance and projected by 2020 to be about $100 billion a year is the Green Climate Fund.
Access to climate finance is exceptionally important for developing countries, especially because they're so highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
The electricity is the most important thing in my job because there is nothing I can do without electricity.
So climate finance can make a really big difference, not only in terms of achieving sustainable development, but also in terms of addressing real issues on the ground, like access to energy.
African countries like Kenya are already investing their own resources in climate-compatible development that is both low-carbon and climate-resilient. But this is not enough. They need to pull in money from external sources, both public and private.
The job of climate finance is to see whether we can influence, particularly where others might invest their money, to see them, if we provide the pre-feasibility for something new and we pay for it, and then we de-risk the investment, we may be in a position to shift over time where Kenya, for example, how it produces its energy.
This is a time for developing countries to seize the opportunity in terms of accessing international funds from both public and private sources. The public funds at startup phase can provide an essential spark to ignite further private funding for low-carbon and climate-resilient projects. The Kenyan government's initial investment in geothermal feasibility is a good example.
The benefit of this is that the company's initial investment is reduced because some of the groundwork has already been covered. Some of the necessary information they need in order to engage in the country is already available, and this reduces the time to invest and the time to, for example, set up your plant.
However, there are some challenges to accessing global climate finance.
Most African countries require to set up the right organizational structures, the legislation, and also the systems for monitoring, measuring, and verification, which are very rigorous before one can access climate finance.
The Climate and Development Knowledge Network has assisted the government of Kenya in preparing to access global climate finance.
We started with an action plan, looking at concrete actions that Kenya could take. So on that natural continuum, CDKN has continued to support the Kenyan decision makers, and we've supported them both to build the business case around particular interventions and to seek accreditation and finance for those ambitions.
Kenya's expansion in geothermal energy is one shining example of successfully harnessing international finance.
Because of sustainability, the cost of production of that power over a long period of time, the cost is generally lower than the other forms of power generation like diesel.
Kenya's geothermal potential is not just in accessing its geothermal resources for its own energy needs. It's been doing that for some time, and it has expansion plans. Its opportunity is to be a geothermal powerhouse, exporting its technology expertise into the region and indeed globally.
Although there is significant ambition and political will, reaching the short, medium, and even long-term geothermal ambitions will be a major challenge.
Currently, Kenya has installed capacity of about 2.3 gigawatts. About 50% of that comes from hydro, but then about 30% of it comes from geothermal. For you to be able to generate, you must first of all start with drilling of the wells. And drilling one well cost about $5 to $6 million. That's, a lot of money.
The availability of power at a lower rate, the initial result is that power bills are reduced for both domestic and commercial consumers, but also it helps in terms of stability of power and availability of electricity. So since the introduction of about 140 megawatts of power in the last 2 years, we have seen a significant reduction in the tariffs.
Kenya's story is a prime example of what global climate finance can do for a country, even a region, and its people.
The important part, and where Kenya provides an example or an illustration, is you have to get started. You have to start examining your evidence. You have to start thinking about what are the potential decisions that could have impacts in the longer term, and then start unpacking the evidence base for that. That's, I think, the role that CDKN plays, is to help decision makers unpack the evidence base.
So say we are doing our best as a country, of course, not necessarily because of international obligations, but for our own good. And that's what the Kenyan stakeholders told us, that they need to see us as a country addressing mitigation, climate change mitigation and adaptation on equal footing for national good.
It is the high time that I think Africa said that I think we have got abundant conditions and resources to invest in renewable energy. And to become a global leader in that regard is the easiest thing that Africa can easily do.